Many years ago, there lived an emperor who was very fond of new clothes, and he spent all his money on making himself look fine. He didn't worry about his soldiers, nor did he care to go to the theatre. But he did like to take drives so he could show off his new clothes. Every hour of the day he changed his clothes, and when one would usually say, "The king is in council," the people here used to say, "The emperor is in his dressing room." In the great town where he lived, life was very merry, and many strangers came every day. One day, 2 swindlers arrived. They called themselves weavers, and said they knew how to weave the most beautifully coloured material. But the clothes made from this material were invisible to anyone who was not fit for the post he held. These must be splendid clothes, thought the emperor, and if he were wearing them, he should be able to find out who in his kingdom was not fitted for his post, and he could tell the clever from the stupid. At once he gave the swindlers large sums of money and asked them to start weaving right away. The pretending weavers set up 2 looms and looked as if they were working, though actually they did nothing at all. They asked for the finest silks and best gold thread. These they put into their own packs and continued their pretended work at the empty looms late into the night. Although the emperor would love to have known how the weavers were getting on with his cloth, he was a little worried that anyone stupid or unfit for his post would not be able to see it. Of course, he was quite certain that he himself had nothing to worry about, but all the same he would prefer someone else to go for him. All the people in the town knew about the power the material had, and each person was curious to see how silly his neighbours might be. After some thought, the emperor decided to send his old and trusted minister, for he was a man of sense and most suitable in his post. So the honest old minister went into the hall where the 2 swindlers were sitting working at their empty looms. He opened his eyes very wide when he realized he couldn't discover the least bit of thread on the looms, but he didn't say anything. Both the swindlers asked him to come closer and see if the design and colours pleased him. The poor old minister looked and still couldn't discover anything on the looms, for a very good reason, as we know there was nothing there. By now the old minister was beginning to wonder if he was stupid and unfit for his post. "Well, Sir Minister," said one of the weavers, "you don't say whether the stuff pleases you."
Oh, it's wonderful, marvellous. The pattern, the colours. I'll certainly tell the emperor how pleased I am."
The weavers then explained the pattern and the different colours of the pretended material, after which they asked for more silk and gold, saying that it was needed to finish what they had begun. However, this too they put into their own packs, and on the looms there wasn't a single thread, but on they went weaving as before on an empty machine. A short time later, the emperor sent another of his trusted statesmen to see how the men were getting on, and when the material would be ready. He too looked and looked, but as there was nothing on the empty loom, of course he couldn't see anything. "Isn't it quite beautiful?" asked one of the swindlers. The statesman was quite sure he wasn't stupid, but maybe he just wasn't fit for the post he held. Anyway, he certainly wasn't going to let others know, so he praised the material and said how delighted he was.
"It really is most charming," he told the emperor.
By this time, the whole town was talking about the splendid material, and the emperor decided he wanted to see it for himself while it was still on the loom. So with a group of his court officials, as well as the 2 trusted men who had already been there, the emperor visited the crafty swindlers, who were working faster than ever, but still with no thread.
"Isn't it magnificent?"
said the 2 old statesmen who had already been there.
"And just look at that pattern and the colours,"
pointing to the empty looms, for they believed that the others could see the material. The emperor was shocked and asked himself if he was stupid and not fit to be emperor. What a terrible thing that would be. and so he said,
"Oh, yes, the cloth is charming, and I approve."
Of course, he couldn't see anything. Everyone else gazed and gazed, and they too couldn't see anything, but they smiled and agreed the cloth was magnificent. The emperor gave the swindlers the title of Imperial Weavers to the court. The day before the annual procession, the two swindlers sat up all night, and they had more than 16 candles lit, so that everyone might see how anxious they were to finish the emperor's new suit. They pretended to roll the cloth off the looms, cut the air with their scissors, and sew with needles and no thread, until at last the suit was ready. They pretended to pass over the trousers, the coat, and the cloak, and suggested that the emperor undress so they could clothe him in his new suit. And so the emperor did this. The swindlers acted as though they were putting each of the new garments on him, and the emperor twisted and turned in front of the mirror. Everyone said how splendid he looked, and what fine royal robes they were. At last, the emperor was ready for the procession, and the lords of the bedchamber felt about the ground as if they were lifting up the train. They moved and acted as if they were holding something in the air. Then the emperor moved off in procession under the royal canopy, and all the people in the street cried out how beautiful the new clothes were, and what a magnificent train on the cloak. Nobody wanted to admit they couldn't see anything.
"But he's got nothing on," said one little child.
"Oh, listen to him,"
said the child's father, and each in turn whispered to his neighbour what the child had said. At last the whole crowd was shouting that it was true. He didn't have anything on. The emperor was most embarrassed, for he knew the people were right, but he thought the procession must go on. So the lords of the bedchamber, taller than ever, marched on, appearing to hold the train, although, of course, there was no train to hold. There was once a most wicked magician who had made a mirror so that when everything good and beautiful was reflected in it, it shrank to practically nothing, while everything ugly and useless showed up wonderfully and looked even uglier than it really was. Those who went to the school of magic where this devil taught spread the word about this strange mirror. They went everywhere with it and even wanted to go to heaven in order to make fun of the angels and God. But the higher they flew, the more the mirror grinned until it slipped out of their hands, fell to the earth and broke into millions of little pieces. Now it caused more trouble than ever, for some of the tiny pieces flew all round the world getting into people's eyes, and once in, they stuck there and made everything look crooked. Some people even got a piece in the heart, and that was terrible, as their hearts became like lumps of ice. Meanwhile, the devil laughed and laughed until he split his sides. But let's see what happened to some of the pieces still flying about. In a big town, where there were so many people in houses there wasn't room for everyone to have a garden, there lived two poor children. Their garden was just a little bigger than a flower pot, and while they weren't brother and sister, they loved each other as if they were. Their parents lived opposite each other in 2 attic rooms, where the roof of one house touched the other, and you could walk over the guttering from one house to the next. Each of the parents had a large window box, in which they grew pot herbs and a little rose tree. The children often used to sit under the rose trees, but in winter this came to an end because of the frosts and snow. One evening, while Kay was getting undressed, he climbed up to the window and peeped through. A few snowflakes were falling, and the biggest of them rested on the edge of the window box. It grew bigger and bigger until it became a most beautiful maiden dressed in the finest white gauze that looked like millions of star-like flakes. When she nodded and beckoned to Kay, he got such a fright he jumped off the chair. The next day there was a frost, and then came the thaw. The sun shone and the roses bloomed again. Once more Kay and the little girl Gerda sat under the rose tree. When Kay and Gerda were looking at a picture book, Kay felt as if something had pricked his heart, and something had flown into his eye. He blinked his eyes. I think it's gone, he said, but it hadn't. It was a piece of that nasty magic mirror, and suddenly everything looked ugly and horrible. He began to tease Gerda, and the games he now played were quite different. Then he told Gerda he had permission to take his sledge into the great square where the other children played, and off he went. It was fun to hitch their sledges onto peasants' carts and be pulled along. A big white sledge arrived, and in it sat somebody wrapped in a rough white fur, wearing a rough white cap. Kay quickly tied his sledge to it and drove off with it. Faster and faster they went, and the driver wouldn't stop. Through the town gates they went, and it was snowing so hard that Kay was really frightened. On and on they went until all at once the snow fell aside and they stopped. The driver stood up, his coat and cap completely made of snow, but it wasn't a man at all. It was a tall, slender lady, the Snow Queen. "What a splendid run," she said, "but you must be cold." And she wrapped her furs around him. When she kissed him, Kay felt colder than ice itself. Then suddenly he didn't notice the cold any more, and he even forgot about Gerda, his grandmother, and everybody else at home. She was very beautiful, and he wasn't frightened in the least. Then off they flew, over forests, lakes, and oceans, and higher than the moon. By day, Kay slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. What happened to little Gerda, though, when Kay didn't return? She told the sunshine that Kay was dead, and the swallows, but they didn't believe her. So one morning she put on her new red shoes and went to ask the river if he knew where Kay was. She even offered to give her shoes to the river if it told her. She climbed into a boat which lay in the rushes and went to the end of it and threw the shoes into the river. Suddenly the boat was loose and was floating away quite quickly. Poor Gerda began to cry, but then she thought, well, maybe the river was taking her to Kay. For hours she floated down the river until she came to a big cherry garden with a little house in it with 2 wooden soldiers standing at the door. Gerda called to them, but of course they didn't reply, and when she called louder, an old woman came out of the house, hobbling along on a stick. "You poor little child," she said, and lifted Gerda out of the boat. Gerda was very pleased to be on dry land again, and she told the old woman everything, asking if she had seen Kay. It appeared he hadn't passed that way, but he would, and not to worry. The old woman had always wanted a little girl like Gerda, and she led her inside, and after feeding her, she brushed her hair. The more she brushed, the more Gerda forgot about Kay. The old woman could work magic, although she wasn't a witch, and she made the rosebuds in her garden disappear so they wouldn't remind Gerda about Kay. But she forgot a rose that was on her sun hat, and when Gerda saw this one hot day, she began to worry about Kay again. She went round the garden asking all the flowers if they knew where Kay was, but of course they didn't. And then Gerda knew she'd have to run away into the wide world and find him. After running a long time, she had to rest, and exactly opposite where she was sitting was a big crow. It was he who told Gerda about Kay and the princess who wanted a husband. Apparently, a boy had walked into the palace one day, and the princess chose him to be her prince. From everything the crow said, he sounded just like Kay, and Gerda became most excited. So a plan was made to get Gerda into the palace to see this prince. That evening after dark, the crow took Gerda to his sweetheart, and she led her away up the stairs to the first apartment and into the bedroom. There on the bed lay Kay, and when Gerda called his name, he awoke, turned his head, but it wasn't Kay after all. Gerda cried and told the prince and princess her story. They felt so sorry for her, and the prince got up and allowed Gerda to sleep in his bed. She had odd dreams of angels dragging a little sledge with Kay on it, but it was just a dream which vanished when she woke up. They wanted her to stay with them, but Gerda begged them to give her a little carriage and horse and a little pair of boots so she might continue looking for Kay. They also dressed her in silk and velvet. Away she drove through the dark wood, where the carriage lights lit up the way and blinded the robbers. "It's gold! It's gold!" they cried, rushing forward, and they seized the horses, killed the driver and the footman, and then dragged Gerda out. An old robber woman thought Gerda so nice and fat that she decided they should eat her, but her robber daughter wanted to play with her. She climbed into the carriage with Gerda, and off they went. "They won't kill you unless I get angry with you. You must surely be a princess." "No," said Gerda, and she told her of all her adventures and how much she loved Kay. The little robber girl decided she herself would kill Gerda if she got angry with her, and at last the carriage stopped outside a robber's castle. Inside, ravens, crows, and pigeons flew around everywhere, and after the two girls had eaten, they went to bed. Oh, it was awful. Soon, though, the robber girl went off to sleep, and Gerda, who didn't know whether she was to live or die, lay and watched the robbers sitting round the fire. Then two of the pigeons told Gerda they had seen Kay in the Snow Queen's sledge, most likely going to Lapland. The reindeer joined in and said the Snow Queen had her summer tent there, but her castle was on the island of Spitzbergen in the North Pole. So the next morning, Gerda told the robber girl all she had heard, and fortunately the robber girl decided to help her, and secretly she put Gerda onto the reindeer's back and told him to run quickly, but to take care of the little girl. For days they rushed on until they were in Lapland. They stopped by a little hut where an old woman was frying fish. After they had told her their story, the Lapp woman said, "You've got a long way to go yet, for the Snow Queen is visiting Finnmark." And she wrote a note for them to give to a Finn woman, as she'd be able to direct them. So off they flew again, and when they came to Finnmark and found the Finn woman's home, they had to knock on the chimney, as she had no door. Inside it was very hot, and the grubby little Finn woman read the note 3 times before listening to the reindeer tell his story first, and then Gerda's. Yes, the Finn woman was able to tell the reindeer that Kay was definitely with the Snow Queen, but because of the splinter of glass in his heart and in his eye, he would never be human again until they came out. Well, surely Gerda could take something to overcome the power. But that wasn't easy, as Gerda already had great power to have come all this way on her own. If she couldn't reach the Snow Queen by herself, then no one could help her. So the reindeer was told to take Gerda as far as the Queen's gardens, put her down by the big bush with red berries, and to hurry back. Gerda forgot her boots and mittens, but the reindeer didn't dare to stop until he got to the bush where he put her down, kissed her, and then ran back. There stood poor little Gerda in the snow, with no shoes or mittens. It was snowing, and as she ran forward, the snowflakes became larger, and they were alive in all curious shapes. Gerda said a prayer, and it was so cold her breath froze as it came out of her mouth. It was like a cloud, and it grew bigger and bigger, till it formed itself into angels, and when they touched her, she hardly felt how cold it was as she walked towards the Snow Queen's palace. It was immensely big, and all made of snow. In the middle of all the snow halls was a frozen lake, its surface broken into 1,000 bits, and in the middle of it sat the Snow Queen when she was home. She called it her Mirror of Reason. Little Kay, blue with cold, although he didn't feel it, spent his time making patterns with the pieces of ice and forming words. There was one word that, if he could think of it and form it, would set him free. Anyway, the Snow Queen flew off to the warm countries and left Kay alone, so stiff you'd have thought he'd frozen to death, and this was how Gerda found him. Throwing her arms round his neck, she cried, "Oh, Kay, thank heaven I've found you at last!" But he just sat quite still. Gerda's warm tears fell on his chest, warming his heart and so melting the lump of ice. Then she talked about the rose tree, and with that Kay burst into tears. "Oh, Gerda," he said, "where have you been for so long? And where have I been?" They were so happy that even the ice around them danced and settled into the word eternity, the word the Snow Queen said would set him free. They took hold of each other's hands, and as they walked out of the palace they talked about grandmother and her roses. There by the berry bush was the reindeer who carried them to the Finn woman, where they were warmed. Then on to the Lap woman, and she had had new clothes made for them. From there they went by sledge into another country, where they were met by a young girl riding a beautiful horse that Gerda knew had pulled her carriage. Sure enough, it was the little robber girl, and they told her everything that had happened. And after saying goodbye, Kay and Gerda walked on until at last they reached their own town. At home, everything was just as they had left it, and all around things were aglow on that lovely summer's day. I wonder if you've ever seen a really old wooden cupboard, quite black with age and covered in carvings. Just such a one sat in a sitting room. It was covered from top to bottom with carved flowers and little stags' heads with antlers. Right in the middle was carved a complete figure of a man. He looked quite odd, as he had goat's legs, small horns on his head, and a long beard. The children called him Top and Bottom Field Marshal Sergeant Major General Billygoat, a rather long and hard name to say. Still, there he was, and all the time looking across towards the table under the mirror, where there stood a pretty little china shepherdess. Her shoes were gold, and her dress was decorated with a red rose. She also wore a golden hat and carried a shepherd's crook. She was very charming. Close by her stood a little chimney sweeper, also made of china, just as clean and neat as the other figures, and though elsewhere he was as black as coal, his face was as fresh and rosy as a girl's. Yes, the china maker could well have made him a prince if he had wanted. There he stood with his ladder, very close to the shepherdess, and they became engaged, for they were both young, both made of the same china, both fragile, so they suited each other. Not far off stood a figure of an old Chinaman, 3 times as big, and he could nod his head. He was also made of china, and although he couldn't prove it, he said he was grandfather to the shepherdess. He claimed to be in charge of her, and he had told Top and Bottom Field Marshal Sergeant Major General Billygoat he could marry the little shepherdess. "You'll have a husband," said the old Chinaman. "One, I do believe, made of mahogany. He can have you made Mrs. Top and Bottom Field Marshal Sergeant Major General Nannygoat. He has a whole cupboard full of silver, which he has stored in secret drawers." "I don't want to go into the dark cupboard," said the little shepherdess. "I've heard it said that he has 11 china wives in it." "Ho! Then you can be the 12th," said the Chinaman.
"This very night, as soon as the old cupboard creaks, you'll be married, as sure as I'm a Chinaman."
And he fell asleep. The little shepherdess wept and gazed at the chimney sweeper, for he was the one she really loved. She begged him to go out into the wide world with her, and he agreed to. He felt sure he could provide for her, and so he showed her how to put her little feet on the carved edges and flowers, till at last they reached the floor. Suddenly, from the old cupboard, a great commotion started up. All the carved stags were twisting and turning their necks. The top and bottom field marshal, Sergeant Major General Billygoat, was jumping around, shouting, "Look, they're running away! They're running away!" Quickly they jumped into the drawer under the windowsill. There were 3 or 4 packs of cards in there, some of which were missing, and a little toy theatre that had been put together as well as possible. There was a comedy being played, and all the queens of spades, hearts, clubs, and diamonds sat in the front row. Behind them stood all the jacks. The play was about 2 people who couldn't marry each other, and the little shepherdess wept, for it was just like her own story. "I can't bear this," she said, and they left the drawer. When they again reached the floor and looked up at the table, they saw the old Chinaman had awakened and was rocking his whole body to and fro with anger. "The old Chinaman's coming," cried the little shepherdess, and she was very frightened. "I've just had a thought," said the chimney sweeper, and he suggested they crept into the big pot-pourri vase and threw salt if the Chinaman came. But that was no good, as the Chinaman and the pot-pourri vase had once been engaged, so the only thing to do was to go out into the wide world. But of course once they did that, they could never come back again. The chimney sweeper knew he had to go through the chimney, and so he asked the shepherdess if she was brave enough to creep through the stove with him, through the flues and the tunnel, and mount up so high they would be safe. He led her to the door of the stove, and through they went. It was very, very dark until they were in the chimney. When they looked up, they saw a lovely star shining down on them, as if it were showing them the way. They clambered and crawled. Oh, it was a terrible way, and very high. But the little chimney sweeper helped her, and at last they reached the edge of the chimney where they sat down to rest. Heaven with all its stars was above them, and below them the town with all its houses, the wide, wide world. The poor little shepherdess had never imagined it like this, and she leant her head on the chimney sweeper's shoulder and cried. She cried so much the gold broke off her dress.
"This is too much," she cried. "It's all too large. Oh, I wish I were back on the table under the mirror. I followed you out into the wide world. Surely, if you really loved me, you would take me home again."
The little chimney sweeper quietly spoke to her about the old Chinaman and top and bottom field marshal Sergeant Major General Billygoat, but she wept so bitterly that he agreed to go back with her. It was very difficult climbing down the chimney, and not at all pleasant, but at last they did find themselves back in the stove. Everything in the room was quiet, and when they peeped out, alas, they saw the old Chinaman lying in the middle of the floor. He had obviously fallen off, as he was broken in 3 places. Top and bottom field marshal Sergeant Major General Billygoat stood where he had always stood, thinking over what had happened. The little shepherdess was so upset, but the little chimney sweeper told her that the old Chinaman could be put back together again, and he'd be as good as new. So they both climbed up to the table to the place where they had stood before. As it happened, the old Chinaman was put back together again, but he could no longer nod his head. Top and bottom field marshal Sergeant Major General Billygoat only wanted to know if the little shepherdess was to be his wife. But of course the old Chinaman couldn't nod his head, and so the chimney sweeper and the little shepherdess remained together, and they loved each other until they broke into many pieces. Marching along the road was a soldier. Because he'd been to the wars, he carried a pack on his back and a sword at his side, and now he was on his way home. On the road, he met an ugly old witch. "Good evening, soldier," she said. "What a great pack and fine sword you have there. You're certainly a real soldier, and for that you shall have all the money you want." "I say, thank you, old witch," said the soldier. The witch then told him to look at the big tree by the side of the road. It was hollow, and if he climbed to the top, he'd see a hole down which he could slide right to the bottom of the trunk. The witch was to tie a rope round his waist so she could pull him up again. "Pray tell me what I am to do at the bottom of the tree," asked the soldier.
"Get the money,"
replied the witch. "Listen to me." And she went on to say how he'd find a passageway down there, all lit with hundreds of lamps. There would be 3 doors, and behind the first door he'd see, sitting in the middle of the room, a great treasure chest with a dog on top. This dog would have eyes as big as teacups, but not to worry, as he'd take her blue check apron with him and sit the dog on this. He'd find copper coins in the chest, and the soldier could take as many as he liked. However, in the next room, where a dog with eyes as big as mill wheels sat on a chest, the soldier would find silver coins, and in the 3rd room was a chest of gold. But the dog sitting on this chest, well, his eyes were as big as watchtowers, but he'd not harm the soldier as long as he was put on the blue check apron. "But what am I to give you, old witch?" said the soldier, "for you can't be doing this for nothing."
"Oh, I am," she said. "Not a penny do I want, but you can bring me back an old tinder box my grandmother left there by mistake."
So giving the blue check apron to the soldier, the witch then tied the rope around his waist, and he climbed down the tree, let himself right down inside the trunk, and everything was just as the witch had said. In the first room, sure enough, was the dog with eyes as big as teacups. "Hello, pretty fellow," said the soldier as he popped the dog onto the witch's apron and took as many pennies as his pockets would hold. Closing the chest, he put the dog back on top and went into the next room, where the dog with eyes as big as mill wheels sat and stared at him. "Now don't stare at me like that. You'll hurt your eyes," said the soldier, and he sat the dog on the apron. Catching sight of all the silver in the chest, the soldier threw away all the pennies, and he filled his pockets and his pack with nothing but silver. Then he went into the next room, and that was terrifying. The dog really had a pair of eyes, each as big as a watchtower, and they rolled round and round. Good evening," said the soldier, and he saluted. He'd never seen such a dog before, and as he stood staring, he thought, well, the sooner it's done, the better. So he removed the dog from the chest. What a sight of gold was there, and so he threw away all the silver and took gold instead. He even filled his boots, and he could hardly move. After putting the dog back on the chest and slamming the door, the soldier shouted up through the tree that he was ready.
"Have you got the tinder box?"
called the witch. "Oh, I'd clean forgotten," said the soldier, and he went to find it. The witch then hauled him up, and there he stood with his pockets, his boots, his pack, and his cap full of gold. When the soldier asked the witch what she was going to do with the tinder box, he was told it was none of his business. This made him so angry, he took out his sword, cut off her head, and then he marched into town. Of course, he was a rich man now, so he booked into the finest inn and ordered his favourite food for dinner. The next day he went shopping, and he bought himself new boots and clothes. He met many people in the street who all talked to him and told him about their town. They even told him the story of their king and his beautiful daughter. It was very sad, though, as no one was allowed to see the princess, because it had been foretold that she would marry a common soldier, and the king didn't like this. "How I'd like to see her just once," thought the soldier. But it was no use wishing for it, so he went on with his merry life, visiting the theatre, driving in the king's gardens, and giving money to the poor, until in the end he had 2 pennies left. Of course he had to shift out of his fine rooms, and none of his friends came to see him any more. One night, when he couldn't even afford a light, he remembered that there was a candle end lying in the tinder box. No sooner had he begun to rub the flintstone to strike a light than sparks flew. The door burst open suddenly, and there stood the dog with eyes as big as teacups. "What are my master's orders?" "What's all this?" asked the soldier. "By Joves, what a useful tinder box if it will get me anything I want." "Go and get some money," he said. And no sooner was the dog gone than he was back again with a big purse of pennies in his mouth. What a wonderful tinder box it was! If he struck it once, the dog with copper coins came. If he struck it twice, the dog with silver came, and if he struck it 3 times, in came the dog with gold. So the soldier moved back into the fine rooms, and once more was wearing his beautiful clothes. One night, as he sat thinking about the beautiful princess, shut up in her castle with many towers, he had an idea. Striking the tinder box once, the dog with eyes as big as teacups came in. "I know it's the middle of the night," said the soldier, "but just the same, I'd love to see the princess, only for a minute." The dog was off like a streak, and he returned with the princess on his back. She was still asleep, but she was so beautiful, the soldier just had to give her a kiss. Then the dog took the princess home. Next morning, the princess told the king and queen that she had had a strange dream and what had happened. The queen thought it a nice story, but insisted that one of the ladies in waiting sit by the princess' bed at night. Sure enough, the dog came again to fetch the princess, and the lady in waiting ran after them. She put a big cross on the door of the soldier's house and went home to bed. After the dog had returned the princess, he saw the cross, so taking some chalk, he put crosses on all the doors in town. When the king and queen came into town with the soldiers, it was useless, as everywhere they looked there were crosses. But the queen was a very clever woman, and she took her big golden scissors, cut up a piece of silk, and sewed it into a pretty little bag, which she filled with flour. She tied this to the princess' back, and then cut a tiny hole in one corner, so the flour could run out and leave a trail. The dog never noticed the flour running out, but the next morning, when the king and queen came with their soldiers, they went straight to the right house. The soldier was thrown in prison to be hanged. Fortunately, he saw through the iron bars the bootmaker's boy, and he asked him if he would go and get the tinder box, and for this he'd earn 4 pennies. This done, the soldier was then led out to the gallows, where he asked if he could smoke one last pipe. The soldier struck the tinder box 1, 2, 3 times, and suddenly there were all the dogs. "Now help me," cried the soldier, "so I shan't be hanged." And the dogs flew at the judges and the whole council, as well as the king and queen. The soldiers were very frightened, and the people cried out, "Dear kind soldier, be our king and marry the lovely princess." So they put the soldier into the king's coach, and the dogs ran ahead of it, while all the people cheered and whistled. The princess came out of the castle and became queen. The wedding lasted 8 days, and the dogs sat at the table staring, with their great eyes going round and round. There was once a woman who was very poor, and for many years her only wish was to have a baby.
One day she met an old witch, and she told her about this wish. "Oh, that's no problem," said the witch. "Plant this small seed I'll give you and see what happens." Thanking the witch, the woman hurried home and planted the seed. After a little while, a most beautiful flower bud grew, and the woman was so excited that she kissed its lovely purple petals. With that, the bud burst open into a tulip, and there, sitting right in the centre of the flower, was a tiny little girl, no bigger than your thumb. And that's how Thumbelina came to be born. At night, she slept in a walnut shell, with flower petals as a mattress. And during the day she played on the table. The woman had put a plate of water with a big tulip petal floating on the top, and Thumbelina would go sailing in this. Everything was very happy, until one night an ugly toad jumped in the window and right onto the table where Thumbelina was fast asleep. The horrid old toad decided Thumbelina would make a lovely wife for her son, and she picked up the walnut shell, hopped back through the window with it, and down to the stream at the bottom of the garden. Ugh! It was all damp and muddy by the stream, and this was where the toad lived with her son. He was ugly too. "Croak, croak," he said when he saw the pretty little girl. "If we put her on a big lily leaf out on the stream," said the toad, "then she can't run away, and we can go and get the front room under the mud ready for your new home." Growing in the middle of the stream were many water lilies, with those broad green leaves which seemed to float on the water. The leaf furthest out, which also happened to be the biggest, was the one they swam out to. Poor Thumbelina, when she woke up the next morning and saw where she was. "Oh dear, oh dear," she cried quietly. She didn't want to live with the nasty old toad or marry her ugly son. The toad took the pretty little bed away and left Thumbelina on the green leaf all by herself. The little fishes swimming about had popped their heads up and seen the pretty little girl, and they realized what was happening, so they quickly nibbled through the stalk of the leaf, and it floated off down the stream. A white butterfly settled on the leaf beside her, and so Thumbelina tied one end of her sash to the butterfly and the other end to the leaf, and they floated along faster than ever. At last, the leaf came to rest on the bank, and Thumbelina found herself at the edge of a big wood. All that summer, Thumbelina lived by herself. She plaited a bed from blades of grass and hung it up under a big leaf which helped keep the rain off. She ate honey from the flowers and drank dew from the flower petals. Summer and autumn passed. Then came winter and the snow. Every snowflake that fell on Thumbelina was like a whole spoonful to us, for remember she was no bigger than your thumb. It was cold, very cold, and Thumbelina decided she'd better look for a new home, so she set off and walked away through the big wood. In time, she came to the door of a little house where a field mouse lived, all snug and warm. Poor Thumbelina stood at the doorway, shivering all over.
Please, may I have something to eat? I'm so hungry.
Oh, you poor little thing, said the field mouse. Come in and have a meal with me. Later on, because she'd taken a liking to Thumbelina, she said, Would you like to stay with me? Help me keep the house clean and tell me stories? So Thumbelina did stay, and she felt very much at home. Each day they would go out walking, and then in the evening they'd sit by the fire, and Thumbelina would tell the field mouse stories, or other times she would sing. Yes, it was all very cosy. One day when they were out walking, Thumbelina found a big bird. It was a swallow, and it looked as if it was dead. This worried her, because she remembered last summer, when all the trees were green and the sun shone warmly, how much she had enjoyed the singing of the swallows. So she made a blanket from hay and covered the bird with it.
Goodbye, Big Bird, and thank you for your lovely singing last summer.
At that moment, Thumbelina was sure she felt the bird move, and she realized it wasn't dead, but sick and cold. For the next few weeks, Thumbelina nursed the bird, and very soon it was fit and healthy again. As soon as spring came, it was time for the swallow to move on. "I shall be flying to the warm countries. Why don't you come with me?" the swallow said. "You can sit on my back and tie your sash around me. Oh, do come with me, Thumbelina." The swallow had grown fond of Thumbelina and didn't want to be parted from her.
"Very well, I'll come with you,"
she said, and she climbed onto the bird's back, tied her sash to one of the strongest feathers, and off they flew into the air, across the sea, high up over the mountains where there's snow all the time. On and on they flew until they came to the warm countries. There were green trees all around, some trees with oranges growing on them, others with lemons. There were pretty flowers dotted everywhere, and there by a blue lake stood a lovely old palace with grapevines growing up the walls. Right at the top of these vines were some swallows' nests, and this was where the swallow carrying Thumbelina lived. "This is my house," the swallow said, "but you may choose your own." Thumbelina looked around and saw some lovely big white flowers growing in a broken pillar down on the ground. The swallow flew her down and put her off onto one of the petals. What a surprise Thumbelina got when she saw a little man sitting in the center of the flower. He was no bigger than Thumbelina.
"I say, isn't he handsome?"
she said to the swallow. Actually, a little man or woman lived in every flower, but he was king of all. The prince was a little frightened of the swallow because it seemed so big to him. When he saw Thumbelina, he thought she was the prettiest girl he had ever seen. Taking his crown off his head and putting it on hers, he asked her her name.
"I'm Thumbelina,"
she replied. The prince then asked her if she would marry him and help him look after all the flowers in the lovely warm country. Thumbelina said yes to the handsome prince, and there was great rejoicing. The swallow sat up in his nest and sang to them all, and everyone was happy. It was summertime, and out in the country the corn was growing, the oats were green, the farmers had made their haystacks, and the young animals were running around. Everything was very busy, and it was lovely in the country at this time of the year. Beside one of the large meadows, bathed in sunshine, stood an old country house. It was surrounded by deep streams with tall trees and bushes growing all around. Down by one of the streams, a duck was sitting on her nest, hatching out the little ducklings. Oh, it was such a tiring business, this waiting, as very few friends came to visit her because they were too busy swimming about in the streams. At last, the eggs did crack, and out popped the ducklings, one after the other. "Quack, quack," said Mother Duck.
"What a big place the world is,"
said her babies. "Do you think this is the whole world?" said Mother Duck. "It stretches way beyond the other side of the garden, but I haven't been as far as that. Are you all here? No, that's not right. The biggest egg still hasn't cracked. Oh, how much longer will it take, I wonder?" And once more she sat down. An old duck passing by asked how things were going, and when Mother Duck told him that one egg just wouldn't crack, he asked to have a look at it. "It's probably a turkey's egg," he said. "I was taken in like that once. If I were you, I'd leave it and go and teach the other babies to swim." Mother Duck thought about this, but she decided to sit just a little longer, as what did a few more days matter? When the egg eventually cracked, out crawled the baby. It was very big, and very ugly. That's an awfully big duckling, thought Mother Duck. It didn't look like the others at all, and she began to wonder if it really was a baby turkey. Well, the only way to find out was to go down to the water, and one by one the little ducklings plopped in. The water went right over their heads, but they soon came up again and started swimming very well. Even the ugly grey baby swam with them. It's not a turkey, thought Mother Duck, as it can swim well, so she was sure it was one of her babies. It was really very pretty if you looked at it properly. After a while, Mother Duck decided it was time to introduce her babies to the great world, and after telling them to use their legs, pull themselves together, and stretch out their necks, they set off. Their tour started in the duckyard, where there was an awful noise, as two families were having an argument. Some of the ducks weren't very friendly, and others made rude remarks. "Those are pretty children, Mother Duck, but look at that one there. He's so big and funny," they said. "Leave him alone," said Mother Duck. "He certainly isn't pretty, but he swims well, and I'm sure he'll be all right when he grows up." And she nudged his neck and smoothed out his feathers. "He is a drake," she went on, "so it doesn't matter quite so much." The old duck told them to make themselves at home. As time went on, things got really worse for the ugly duckling, as he was chased, bitten, teased, and even his sisters were horrid to him. So one day he ran away, far, far away from the duckyard, and as he passed bushes and trees, the birds flew up into the air. "That's because I'm so ugly," thought the little duckling, still running on. By night time, he had come to a big lake where some wild ducks lived. He was very miserable and very tired, so he settled down at the edge of the lake and went to sleep. Early the next morning, one of the wild ducks flew over to him. "Hello, what sort of chap are you?" he asked. "You're very ugly, but we don't mind as long as you don't marry into our family." Of course, the poor little duckling had never thought of marriage. He just wanted a place to rest. That was not to be, as the next moment there were some loud bangs. It was duck shooting time, and there were men everywhere with their dogs. The little duckling was so frightened he hid his head under his wing. More shots rang out, and into the lake jumped the dogs. Suddenly, close beside the little duckling was a very big dog, with his tongue hanging out and his eyes all shining. He poked his nose right up against the duckling, showed his sharp teeth, and next thing he ran off without grabbing him. "Oh, that was lucky," thought the duckling. "I'm so ugly, even the dog doesn't like to bite me." So he lay quite still until the guns had stopped shooting, and when everything was quiet again, he hurried out of the lake and went rushing across some fields and meadows. Towards night time, he came to a broken-down hut where an old woman lived with her cat and hen. "You're a strange little thing," said the old woman, "but you can stay and lay me some duck eggs." So for 3 weeks the duckling stayed there, but no eggs came because, of course, he was a drake. But the cat and hen didn't know this, and they just thought he was silly and not very good at laying eggs. So there he lay in a corner, feeling so miserable that he decided it was time he moved on. By now, autumn was nearly over, and it was becoming much colder. The poor little duckling was miserable and lonely, and one afternoon, as the sun was setting, a whole flock of beautiful birds flew out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen anything so beautiful. They were very white, with long necks, and they gave a most peculiar cry. They were swans. They flew so high, and the little duckling was so excited just watching them that he whirled himself round and round in the water and gave such a loud cry he even frightened himself. As soon as they were out of sight, he dived to the bottom of the lake and back up again. He didn't know what the birds were called, nor was he even jealous of them, as it didn't enter his head to wish he was as lovely. All he wanted was for other ducks to be friendly with him and to find a new home. This wasn't easy, as no one wanted him, and by now it was winter and very cold, with ice on the water and snow everywhere. However, we'll try and forget that winter, as it was all very sad, and no one could have been happier when the sun shone again than the little duckling. The birds were singing in the trees, and the duckling found he could flap his wings strongly, and he could fly far higher. He decided he wanted to fly like those beautiful birds he had seen, and sitting on the water one afternoon, he stretched his neck, and as he looked at his reflection, he couldn't believe what he saw. No longer was he a clumsy, dirty grey bird, ugly and awkward, but a lovely swan. He was so happy he didn't know what to do. He ruffled out his feathers, stretched his slender neck, and cried out joyfully. He just didn't dream, when he was an ugly duckling, that there could ever be such happiness.